Hi there, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Gardener, and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. It's July 18th. Today we celebrate the English naturalist who kept a journal for almost 3 decades, and we'll also learn about the popular English novelist who loved to garden. We'll salute the father of American landscape architecture and his trip to Gettysburg on this day in 1863. And we also recognize the Spanish woman who pioneered the system of organic gardening known as synergistic gardening. We'll hear a classic poem for gardeners, and we grow that garden library with a book devoted to the ecology, evolution, and life history of solitary bees. It's a must-read for gardeners who are dedicated to learning more about our precious pollinators. And then we'll wrap things up with a Maxfield Parrish print that is beloved by gardeners ever since it appeared on the cover of Collier's magazine on this day many decades ago. But first, let's catch up on some greetings from gardeners from around the world and today's curated news. Well, first up is a photo from Joy M., who shared a photo of her daylilies. She wrote, "The daylilies are blooming." And they certainly are. Joy has over 20 hybrids growing in her garden. Then next, Jan V. in Nebraska shared a picture of her pride and joy. It's her elephant ears. And she writes, "Can you please wish a happy birthday to my garden buddy Bob?" And yes, we can. Happy birthday, Bob. And then finally, Erin M. wrote in to show a picture of her tomatillos. And she writes, "I don't know why, but they're doing especially well this year." And you know, I have some tomatillos on my patio right now, and they're doing great here as well. So maybe it's the year of the tomatillo. Who knows? All I know is it was not a good year for radish for me this spring. So hopefully you had better luck with your radish than I did. I was talking to Mom about this last week. Their radish crop was a bust as well. So I don't know why, but this was not a good year for radish for us, which bums me out because I really love radish. But we'll give it another go in August, and we'll see if we do better in the back half of the summer. All right, that's it for today's Gardener Greetings. Now, if you'd like to participate in the Gardener Greetings segment, just send your garden pics, stories, birthday wishes, and so forth to me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. That's jennifer@thedailygardener.org. Here's today's curated news. Well, I've been excited to share this post with you by Mary Kate Mackey. She wrote it a few weeks ago, and it's called "This 5-Minute Exercise Will Make You a Better Gardener." What a great title. And here's a little excerpt from Mary Kate's post. She writes, "Phyllis Helland is a friend of mine who's a home gardener and also an artist by profession. Every day she spends a few minutes observing and drawing the growth on a single plant. This is an exercise in seeing, not producing a recognizable sketch. And Phyllis advises that if you think you don't draw well, simply switch to your non-dominant hand. I always see more when I do that because it slows me down. Or use a phone camera instead. That's more of a broad stroke, but it still helps me see. It's like being a little kid again. Kids notice things, and the adults are astonished." Now, how does this simple exercise help your gardening? That's the question that Mary Kate asks. And Phyllis says it will raise your awareness of what's going on around you, whether it's those previously unnoticed predaceous bugs on the beans or a glorious unplanned flower combination. The daily observations can also deepen your knowledge. And oh, did I love that insight. So I'm going to try this. I thought this was fantastic. And how much more simple could it be? So give it a try this weekend. The 5-minute exercise that will make you a better gardener And all you have to do is observe and draw the growth on a single plant. It's a deal. Done. Now, if you'd like to check out Mary Kate's post for yourself, and I think you should, just search for the word better in the Facebook group for the show, and this post will pop up. Now, recently I've started collecting cuttings from my garden to make my own potpourris and sachets. And you can read all about it in my blog post, but I thought I'd just quick share this marvelous quote from Eleanor Sinclair Road about this lovely garden pastime. She wrote, "No bought potpourri is so pleasant as that made from one's own garden. For the petals of the flowers one has gathered at home hold the sunshine and memories of summer. And of past summers, only the sunny days should be remembered." It's great advice. And finally, I wanted to share this little reminder with you to do a summer check of all of your irrigation systems so that you can repair anything that's broken. You know, a few summers ago, I failed to do this, and by the time I discovered a leak, we had big water problems to address. Just this past week, I noticed that one of my sprinkler heads had lost its rotation setting, and so I was actually watering the neighbor's lawn instead of this area where I had just planted new shrubs. So it definitely pays to pay attention to your irrigation system. And in the garden, too much water can be just as harmful as too little. And if you throw in temperature extremes, you have the perfect storm for inviting fungal and other diseases, pests, and problems. And boy, talk about temperature extremes. This weekend in Minnesota, our heat index is going to be 110 degrees. And if you're experiencing those types of extreme temperatures, you definitely want to make sure that your irrigation system is working properly. All right, that's it for today's gardening news. Now, if you'd like to check out any of my curated news articles or original blog posts for yourself, you're in luck because I share all of it with the listener community in the free Facebook group for the show, the Daily Gardener Community. So there's no need to take notes or search for links. The next time you're on Facebook, just search for the Daily Gardener Community and request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. Here's today's brevities. Today is the birthday of the English naturalist Gilbert White. He was born on this day in 1720. Gilbert kept a journal for almost 3 decades, and he recorded his observations of his garden. Gilbert's observations were eventually published as a calendar of flora and the garden, and then they were woven into a book called The Naturalist's Journal. People immediately recognized that Gilbert had a gift for observation and for describing with vivid clarity the natural world. Here's a little excerpt from what he wrote in his journal on this day in 1781. It was his 61st birthday. He wrote, "Farmers complain that their wheat is blighted. In the garden at Dowlands stands a large Liriodendron tulipifera, or tulip tree, which was in flower. The soil is poor sand, but it produces beautiful pendulous larches. Mr. R's garden abounds in fruit and in all manner of good and forward kitchen crops. Many China asters this spring seeded themselves there. Some cucumber plants also grew up of themselves from the seeds of a rejected cucumber thrown aside last autumn. Mr. R's garden is at an average of fortnight before mine." Gilbert White's journals are a treasure, and luckily we can read them for ourselves now online at one of my favorite websites. It's called The Natural History of Selborne, The Journals of Gilbert White. And you can find it at naturalhistoryofselborne.com. And I'll have a link to it in today's show notes as well. And today is the anniversary of the death of the author and gardener Jane Austen, who died on this day in 1817. Jane loved gardens. She had a heart for ornamentals, herbs, and kitchen gardening. And her family always had a garden, growing their food and beautifying their homes with flowers. In every one of her books, Jane included gardens. And we know from her letters to her sister Cassandra that the gardens brought her joy, and they were also very grounding for her. In 1807, Jane wrote about the redesign of her garden, which included syringa or mock orange and laburnum, a small tree with beautiful hanging yellow flowers in the spring, which is how it got the common name golden chain or golden rain. Jane wrote, "I could not do without a syringa." And we also talk of a laburnum. The border under the terrace wall is clearing away to receive currants and gooseberry bushes, and a spot is found very proper for raspberries. And in 1814, she wrote about the garden outside the rented room where she was staying. She wrote, "The garden is quite a love. I live in the room downstairs. It's particularly pleasant, opening upon the garden. I go and refresh myself every now and then come back to solitary coolness." Wonderful. And it was on this day that the father of American landscape architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted, walked the Battle of Gettysburg just 15 days after the battle on this day in 1863. Now, many people don't remember that Olmsted served as the General Secretary of the United States Sanitary Commission. He oversaw the support of the sick and wounded soldiers of the United States Army during the Civil War. And there were times when Olmsted personally treated the battlefield wounds of soldiers. Olmsted was recruited for this job based on his success in designing and overseeing New York's Central Park, which was one of the country's most significant public works projects. And a week after the battle at Gettysburg, Olmsted arranged for 40 tons of supplies to flow into Gettysburg every day, bringing in items like surgeon's silk, fans, butter, shoes, and crutches. And it was on this day in 1863 that the scene had settled down enough that Olmsted could walk the fields of Gettysburg. In Martin's biography of Olmsted, he shared that Olmsted, quote, "was struck by the scale of the place. Everything had happened across distances far greater than he had supposed." Ever attuned to the landscape, Olmsted also noted that, quote, "the hills were gentle and rolling, so very out of kilter with the carnage that was everywhere still in evidence." Olmsted came across spent shells and twisted bayonets, broken down wagons, and half-buried dead horses. And particularly touching to Olmsted was the random strew of Union and Confederate caps, often together on the ground, shot through with bullet holes. And today is the birthday of the Spanish woman who pioneered a system of organic gardening known as synergistic gardening, Amelia Haslip, who was born on this day in 1937. Amelia was born in Barcelona, and as a young adult, she embraced communal living and was part of the hippie movement. Amelia managed to make her way to California, where she worked on ecological farms. And at the time, Ruth Stout's no-work gardening and Alan Chadwick's raised bed concept were all the rage. Back in 1977, Masanobu Fukuoka's book, The One Straw Revolution, was translated into English. Amelia got a copy, read it, and immediately set about applying the principles in her own garden. And by the time Amelia started tinkering with Fukuoka's principles, she was 40 years old, and she'd been gardening for about 17 years. The gardening system Amelia Hayslip devised became known as synergistic gardening, and it was a mashup of Fukuoka's ideas and elements of permaculture. And Amelia was the perfect person to come up with synergistic gardening. She was attuned to nature, and she questioned the effectiveness of human methods that altered natural systems. YouTube has a great video of Amelia showing how she created an edible vegetable garden. She said, "The work of Fukuoka was proof that my intuition was right, meaning that working the land is not necessary. However, when I started to reproduce it, the results I obtained were so poor that I quickly understood the need to modify and adapt his system to other cultural and climatic conditions. This is how it was born, what I decided to call synergic agriculture." Back in 2012, Monica Brandeis wrote an excellent article on Amelia, and it was featured in the Tampa Tribune. Here are some highlights. She writes, "I watched a DVD of The Synergistic Garden with Amelia Hayslip twice, and I learned some new ideas that Rosalind Baker is already using with success." Hayslip says the following: "Don't worry about fertilizer. Don't disturb the soil any more than necessary. No tilling or digging. No stepping that compacts the soil. This way, the earthworms and microorganisms in the soil can work with multiplied efficiency. And instead of the soil wearing out as it does in modern agriculture, it gets better year by year. Cut down on compost. Hayslip uses no compost except in potting soil, in flats in the greenhouse. Elevate beds. Hayslip's beds are elevated 10 to 30 inches by digging deeper paths and piling the soil up on the beds that are 4 feet wide, so it's possible to reach the center without stepping in. Her paths, by the way, are 20 inches wide. Cover the soil with mulch. The beds are always covered with organic mulch straw in her case, leaves in mine. But I have sinned by leaving some soil bare. I will try never to do that again. Nature always keeps the soil covered." Hayslip pulls back the mulch to add seeds or transplants, but pushes it back right away around the transplants. And Hayslip removes spent plants by cutting them off just above ground level so the roots stay in the ground, which is very important. And the part of the plant that you don't eat is laid on top as additional mulch. And over the years, you need less and less mulch. Finally, use the weeds you pull. Weeds are pulled out by the roots and laid in the path until they're dead. Then they're added to the mulch. At first, Amelia's beds need hand weeding as much as any other bed, but as the years go by, they need less and less weeding. And Hayslip used a spoon to plant some of her transplants and a trowel for the ones that needed a larger hole, but that was the extent of her digging. And Monica ends her piece by saying, "I'm now doing as much of this as possible. It's never too late to learn." Great article. In Unearthed Words, here's a poem called The Gardener by Robert Louis Stevenson, the Scottish novelist and poet, from his book, A Child's Garden of Verses. The gardener does not love to talk. He makes me keep the gravel walk. And when he puts his tools away, he locks the door and takes the key. He digs the flowers green, red, and blue, nor wishes to be spoken to. He digs the flowers and cuts the hay, and never seems to want to play. Silly gardener, summer goes, and winter comes with pinching toes. When in the garden bare and brown, you must lay your barrow down. Well, now and while the summer stays, to profit by these garden days, oh, how much wiser you would be to play at Indian wars with me. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, The Solitary Bees by Brian Danforth, Robert McKinley, John Neff, and Frances Fawcett. This book came out in August of 2019, and the subtitle is Biology, Evolution, Conservation. And the author, Alexandra Maria Klein, said, "This book is a comprehensive, most up-to-date resource on the biology and evolution of solitary bees." People reading this book will likely further educate their friends, children, or colleagues by sharing stories about the interesting natural history of solitary bees. An increasing number of people will ultimately contribute to protect nature and biodiversity. And Stephen Fleming said, "In the many vignettes and case studies throughout the text, the wonders of solitary bees are revealed. I expect to return to this book to learn more about the truly incredible world of bees for a long time to come." This book is a whopping 488 pages devoted to the ecology, evolution, and life history of solitary bees, and the cover is gorgeous. It's just one big, beautiful bee illustration, and it's a must-read for gardeners dedicated to learning more about our precious pollinators. It's the latest and greatest research and data on bees. You can get a copy of The Solitary Bee by Brian Danforth, Robert McKinley, John Neff, and Frances Fawcett, and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $31. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. On this day in 1908, the Maxfield Parrish print called The Botanist appeared on the cover of Collier's magazine. Parrish's image shows a full-length profile of a man wearing a long botanical green coat. In his raised right hand, he is holding a plant, and in his left hand, he is clutching a magnifying glass. Some opened reference books are tucked under his arm, and he has a specimen case slung over his back. This classic image was made into poster-sized prints in the 1970s. This piece was a departure for Maxfield Parrish, and it's one of my favorite pieces of botanical art. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener, and remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Wyoming, Minnesota with the help of Paige Mance, Brooke Bierbaum, Kiana Rayleigh, Maddie Doyle, Natalie Decker, and Eric Begay. You can find The Daily Gardener on all your favorite social media. You can follow the show on Instagram, and listeners always have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. All the stories and books that are featured on the show can be found over at thedailygardener.org, thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. Last but not least, you can share your own gardener greetings on the show by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.